and guaranteed representation for all strata of Haftabte workers. An election was held in which the workers from all 15 departments of Haftabte voted for 22 people as their representatives, who later elected 9 people as members of the Association of Workers' Representatives. Workers referred to this new establishment as workers' councils and demanded the management of the company to be transferred to the councils. In fall 2018, Haftabte Workers' Council organized peaceful but massive protests which spread throughout the town of Shush. Along with their families, the workers gathered in front of the governor's office. This was concomitant with another workers' strike in the province of Khuzestan by the workers of Ahvaz National Steel Group. Announcing solidarity with each other, striking workers of both companies received messages of support from teachers and students' organizations around the country. Videos of strikes and the heated speeches made by workers went viral on social media, forcing even the staunchest advocates of free market ideology in Farsi-speaking media, both inside and outside the country, to cover the protests and express support. What made these protests distinct from the previous strikes was the politicized, all-inclusive, rational, and objectivist discourse of the workers' reps in these videos, their adamancy and hope, along with the unprecedented coordination and solidarity among workers. In the context of the prevalent atomization promoted by hegemonic neoliberal ideology, workers' protests displayed democratic collective solidarity of people courageously organizing and demanding a greater share in administrating their life and work. This panel is organized in honor of Haftabte workers with the firm belief that in an age when we are once again facing the ominous rise of authoritarianism from India to Europe and the US, academia has an obligation to seriously engage with the struggles of workers, women, students, minorities, and all oppressed people, to think along with them on the existing conditions, not to merely glorify these struggles, but to responsibly reflect on them and not shy away from criticism while standing by the democratically organized progressive forces around the world. It is also motivated by the hope for a change in the prevalent discourse on the Middle East in American academia, which by reducing all affairs of the region to culture and religion has had an important role in silencing the struggles of popular forces for democracy and justice. Thank you very much.
Now I'm going to play a video of the strikes just to give a context.
واگذاری شرکت از بخش خصوصی به بخش دولتی تا زمانی کسی پاسخگوی کارگرای هفت‌تپه و خانواده هاشون نباشه کار تو این شرکت تعلیقه. از فردا اعتصاب به فرمانداری منتقل میشه. ما 5 تا زن بودیم دیروز. 5 تا زن بودیم دیروز. و بستن جاده تونستیم انقلابی ایجاد کنیم که خبرمون به فرمانداری و استانداری به تمام بخش‌های کشوری به وزارت به همه جا برسه.
سلامتیشون.
وزارت کار وزارتیه که باید همیشه کمر کارگر داشته باشه، باید پشت کارگر باشه. وزارت کار 28 روز کف خیابون ایستادیم، فریاد زدیم، حقمون خواستیم، بازداشتمون کردن. الانم پرونده های پرسنل هنوز توی دادگاه ها بازه. بچه های هفت‌تپه امروز توی بازداشتن. آقای وزارت کار، وزارت رفاه، این چه رفاهیه؟ چه کاریه؟ تا به امروز من کارگر باید چطور احساس بکنم که شما پشت من هستید؟ آیا چیزی احساس میکنید که این آقای پشت شما هستن؟ تا به این نیازی احساس کردید؟ به این وزارت کار، وزارت کارگری یا سرمایه داره پشت سرمایه‌دار و بورژواها رو گرفتین یا پشت من کارگر؟ چرا باید برای حق خودم کف خیابون بیستم و اونجا پرونده برای من ساخته بشه؟
داریم داد میزنیم سر دولت که این آقایون این کارن، دارن با برند هفت تپه، یعنی اون مارک تجاری هفت تپه سوء استفاده میکنن. حالا یا وارداتشون رو به نام این شرکت انجام میدن، یا وامهاشون رو به نام این شرکت انجام میدن میگیرن، یا اون تسهیلات ارزیشون رو دارن میگیرن. توجه داری؟ از روز اول ما داریم اینو داد میزنیم به شرکت، به دولت میگیم آقا کارخونه شرکت هفت تپه مال ما کارگرا بوده، مال مردم اینجا بوده، با چه قراردادی با چه شرایطی اینو دادی به مثلا بخش خصوصی؟ ما میگیم دولت هم مقصره. ما آلترناتیومون شورا و جمعیه، ما فرد محور نیستیم، فرد طلب نیستیم. فرد طلبان و ناسیونالیستا و نجات پرستا مرتجعین خودشونو به ما نچسبونن. آلترناتیو ما شوراهای کارگری است، یعنی جمعی تصمیم میگیریم برای سرنوشت خودمون، از پایین حکم صادر میکنیم.
توی چند روز به جای که مسائل ما رو حل کنه تا تونستن دروغ گفتن. استاندار و وزیر در اومدن توی صدا و سیما گفتن هفت تپه یک شرکت ورشکسته بوده، ببین چطور از دزدا حمایت میکنن. 13,000 میلیارد فرار کردن باز ازشون حمایت میکنن. میگن اسد بیگی ها و رستمی اومدن شرکت رو نجات دادن، به تولید رسوندن. دروغ سر دروغ، دروغ سر دروغ. ما اگر 10 تا حقوق هم بهمون بدن تا خصوصی سازی تو این منطقه است، اعتصاب ادامه دارد. خواهش میکنم فریب این حرکاتی که خودشون شروع کردن نخوریم، کاری نکنیم که بهانه دستشون بدیم و اون صدا سیما بیاریم این اعتصاب زیبا و مسالمت آمیز ما رو خراب کنه. ما حرفمون حقه. تمام مردم ایران، تمام مردم شوش، تمام طبقه کارگر، فرهنگیان عزیز، دانشجویان، بچه مدرسه‌ای ها، خانواده ها، هممون حمایت کردن. این یعنی چی؟ یعنی ما بر حقیم، ما از حقمون کوتاه نمیایم. اولادیای عزیز، فراموشتون نکردیم، میدونیم که از ما یاد میکنیم، ازتون یاد میکنیم، دستتون رو به گرمی میفشاریم، ادامه میدیم تا به پیروزی برسیم. نامکار آزادی اداره شورایی، نامکار آزادی اداره شورایی، نامکار آزادی اداره.
So, good afternoon. My name is Stephanie Luce. I'm a professor of labor studies and sociology here at CUNY, and I'm honored to chair the panel here this afternoon. So, I will be introducing our speakers, and they'll each give a presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. So, I'm thinking maybe everyone can come up at once if you're willing to do so. Just come up to the front here, take a seat, and I'll move the mics over. So I'm going to read just, in the interest of giving more time for the presentations, I'm going to read an abbreviated biography of the speakers, and then we will proceed to the panel. And I believe our order, our first presentation is Saeed Rahnema, who is an award-winning retired professor of political science and public policy at York University in Canada. He has served as director of York's School of Public Policy and Administration and a director of the Middle Economic Association. In his homeland, Iran, he was a senior member of the Industrial Management Institute in Tehran. During the Iranian Revolution of 1979, he was a leading activist in the left and workers' council movements. One of his recent works includes The Transition from Capitalism, Marxist Perspectives. Our second speaker, I believe, is that the second speaker? Okay. Zeb Kalb is a doctoral student in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is interested in political and comparative historical sociology. He specializes in the study of contentious politics, development, and stratification, with a focus on the Middle East and West Asia. Our third speaker will be Sohrab Behdad, who is a professor of economics at Denison University. He received his Ph.D. in economics from Michigan State University and was a faculty of economics at the University of Tehran in 1973 to 1983. He's a member of the Board of Trustees of Irani Academia, the Institute for Social Sciences and Humanities, and a founding member of International Iranian Economic Association. And some of his publications include Class and Labor in Iran, To the Revolution Matter. And then our fourth speaker will not be joining us, but we will have a representative read his paper. Is that right? He's Mohammad Maljoo, who studied at the Faculty of Economics, University of Tehran, from where he received his PhD degree in economics in 2005. He was a research fellow at International Institution of Social History in Amsterdam, as well as in London. Okay, so we will start our panel.
Thanks very much. The paper that I'm going to discuss, the title is Councils During the Iranian Revolution of 1979. But I'm not going to discuss it in full, although I will go through it, but I want to discuss the whole notion of shura, or council, which became so prominent after, particularly after they referred to shura as you saw. The subtitle is Relevancy, Irrelevancy of Workers' Control Then and Now. So, World Council's shuras during the Iranian Revolution of 1979 were no doubt the most remarkable aspect of revolution. They were a main force in crippling the Shah's regime. No wonder the present Islamic regime is so fearful of workers' protests and brutally suppresses any move on their part. The Islamists have learned that street protests and demonstrations, while menacing and threatening, cannot seriously threaten the regime unless they are supported by mass strikes of industrial workers and employees, the way it happened during the revolution. The shuras, like all other managerial work councils anywhere else in the world, were short-lived and failed to achieve their goals. I'll discuss which type of shura, because the whole notion, we have so many different types, and this has created lots of confusion. Among other reasons that I will discuss shortly, the Iranian workers leapt into this highest form of labor organizing without having any substantial experience in organization. Though modern industry in Iran has been around for almost a century, the history of the industrial labor movement is much shorter, intermittent, and discontinuous. I will not go too much to history because your own Armand Ibrahimian, the most prominent Iranian historian, is here, so I will not discuss it anywhere. To be brief, only in 4 periods of the last century, where the central powers were weak, we see some sort of workers' movement. We have always workers' activism, but we cannot call them all movement. The first is in early 1920s, pre-Reza Shah dictatorship. Second in 1941 to 48, post-Reza Shah, and early Mohammad Reza Shah period. Third in 1951-53 during Mossadegh era. And finally from the 1977 prelude to the Iranian Revolution until 1980 and the consolidation of the Islamist power. Most labor unions that were created during the first 3 intervals had certain common characteristics. Aside from several independent craft unions or syndicates, most of the major unions were established by the left and communist organizations. And this had its own positive and negative aspects that I will not get to in this discussions. They were all organized from top down, and there were no industrial unions. In these intervals, we witnessed major activism with some significant gains for workers, However, with the return of dictatorship, these labor organizations would disappear and be replaced with the state-run fake unions. In the fourth period of labor activism during the Iranian Revolution, with the major economic crisis in the late 1970s, along with gradual erosion of Shah's power, workers and employees began to demand a set of reforms, increased job security, improved job classification, as well as wage demands. These led to the creation of secret strike committees in a growing number of factories. As the political crisis deepened, many owners of the private sector abandoned their factories and left the country. Managers in the state-owned industries could not function either, leaving the large industries of Iran without leadership and forcing the strike committees to take over the factories. So this is where, like in several other cases in history in other parts of the world, we see workers actually taking control of the factories. So they became, in a sense, managerial councils. Like in Russia, like in Germany, that I will touch upon shortly. The Islamists who soon came to consolidate their power were against these councils, mostly because they were controlled by the left. To give you an example, the Union of Councils of IDRO, Industrial Development Renovation Organization of Iran, consisted of 110 industries, major industries, and old industries. It was the largest conglomerate of industries in Iran. When we organized different councils and then the union, the central council was elected by 55 members from almost 90 factories. That 55, they elected an executive of 16 members. When we got together, and many of us did not know each other, we found out that almost everybody among these 16 are somehow linked to one of these political left organizations, or some few liberals and also Mujahideen Khalb. There were not a single Islamist in the group. So one of our tasks was actually to go and find for a sensible Islamist member, to become a member of the council, because Khomeini was the leader of the revolution. It was called the Islamic Revolution. The new regime's first strategy was to bring the council under its own control. And when this failed, they started to establish Islamic councils, Shura Islami. And they used Anjuman-hai Islami, Islamic associations, which they had created in all workplaces. These Islamic associations acted like Arbat Front during Nazi Germany or Sampo during wartime in Japan. And they did lots of damage to all of these councils. With the American Embassy hostage crisis in November 1979, which ironically all shuras, all councils supported, and subsequent outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War in September 1980, the regime consolidated its power and suppressed all political movements. The Islamic councils replaced the genuine councils, and we were all expelled. Some were imprisoned, and several of our colleagues were also executed later. Before these events, councils were very powerful. In many cases, we even refused to negotiate with the government, and also we could appoint managers. Even the CEO of the Industrial Management Institute was somehow the one that we recommended, and Bazargan government agreed with that. While separation and lack of democracy were major factors in the demise of the councils, there were also internal problems. The shuras were operating in a union-less industries and were trying to perform both the function of council and managerial participatory organization, and also that of a union defending the rights of the workers and employees. All of these were enterprise or house organizations, so they were not linked together to like an industrial union. And this was one of their major weaknesses. the unions that we created, along with several other unions by oil companies, steel company, they were also clusters of industries of, in a sense, sort of umbrella organization for these. Most importantly, these councils had no links to community and also city level organizations. Councils were comprised of both workers and the middle class, salariés. And while this gave strength to the councils because they provided managerial capabilities, but at the same time, it also generated hidden class conflicts. But the most contentious issue was conceptual, related to the notion of council itself. The term shura was adopted by the left, inspired by the Soviets of the Russian revolutions. But the shuras were not Soviets, which were organs of political power, organizing workers and soldiers and sailors at the city level, nor they were similar to the Turin councils of 1920 in Italy, which were organs of self-government, short-lived for a few weeks, but at least significant, like the Paris Commune and others. The Russian equivalent of shuras was the factory committee, which were formed in each enterprise. The multitude of left organizations each had developed their own views about work councils. Their sympathizers active in shuras would bring the confused policies of their organization and with no understanding of workings of democratic institutions. Internal ideological conflicts, which councils were, was the most significant problem, leading to a situation that members affiliated with different organizations were competing rather than cooperating with each other. This was a time that anti-socialist and pro-Islamist propaganda of the new regime had driven a political wedge into the ranks of all workers. For most of the left activist councils were supposed to be managerial versus consultative or participatory ones. And hence focus was on workers' control kargari, without making clear what this really means and how and under which conditions such a thing is possible. Years later in exile, I argued that managerial councils not only could not be a viable and sustainable option in Iran of the time, considering the nature of Iranian industries and the configuration of the working class, this was not possible, but that it could not be materialized anywhere in the world. And there are lots of examples of it. No doubt we can have worker control in a small shop, a dairy factory which several workers co-own, or in a co-op. But could a national oil company or national transportation system or national grid or water system or auto industry be solely controlled by their workers? Everywhere that they emerged, work councils were products of some sort of crisis, and when the crisis was over, they also disappeared. The most significant one in Russia, the work committees later became part of a troika, consisting of plant manager, the Communist Party sales secretary, and head of the local union. And under Stalin, they completely were wiped out. In 1920s Turin, the short-lived takeover of factories by the locked-out workers was terminated through assaults by fascist gangs supported by the capitalists and ended. They could not continue. In Weimar, Germany, the councils persisted because they were transformed from managerial councils to participative ones. And that's not a long history, and it is very significant. Only in Yugoslavia, work councils which had emerged in 1949, 1950, did exert control in the state-run factories through work collectives, and persisted for a long time. And that was solely because the governing Communist Party was supporting it. But when the party collapsed, all those councils also were ended. I mean, this is a very important notion that councils as worker control could only happen when it has got the support of power from the state. Without that, it's not possible. And in essence, it is organization of the future, not now under capitalism. All in all, Iran, as a result of both external factors, namely repression and democracy, lack of democracy, and also internal structural factors, the councils were not in a position to manage the industries. What needed at that time was really industrial unions and turn councils into consultative councils as an arm of the participation for unions. 40 years after the Iranian Revolution, as was mentioned, a heroic strike by workers of a large sugarcane factory in Haftapeh in southern Iran, where unpaid workers were on strike. As part of their demand, they mentioned Shura, or council. It's not very clear that really what exactly they meant by Shura, but the left inside Iran, part of the radical left in Iran and outside Iran, got very excited about this, and then they brought back and said that there is a need for workers' control of Haftapeh and other large industries. And you have got a multitude of articles and declarations by all these organizations about the significance of workers' control as an immediate demand of the workers. I, for one, argued against the easy slogans. And to make my point, by referring to the latest available data of the Iranian manufacturing sector and industrial workers, I put forward a set of explicit questions and concluded that instead of managerial councils, the Haftapeh workers and indeed workers of other factories need an industrial union with a participatory arm or Shuraye Musharakati, not Shuraye Mudiriya. Here, without going into the details, first, just a brief look at the nature of industries, the size of the employment. See that about 85% of industries are 1 to 9 employees, and then we have got 11% and 8% as 10 to 49 and 50 plus. Even for the larger or the medium-sized industries, you see the vast majority of them, 49, are small, between 10 to 19, or even for the largest industries, 50 above, we see that almost 46% are 50 to 99. So the vast majority, over 90% of Iranian industries are very small. And then the question is that whether we are talking about these or not. So this is the structure of Iranian industry. I will not discuss it. Now, in terms of ownership, 93% are private, 5% are so-called cooperative, and 2% public. And this is most interesting because after the revolution, 750 of the largest industries of Iran were confiscated and then were nationalized. But it's interesting that all of those were later privatized. For those of you who may not know the exact meaning of privatization, in Islamic Republic means that it was given to Islamic institutions and also to sons and daughters of mullahs and clerics. So this is privatization. And here, I will not discuss the deindustrialization that followed, which is one of the most tragic cases that is happening. If there was time, I will not to discuss part. The proponents of workers' control implicitly focus on large industries. So as I said, 91% are small, so the focus is on large industries for workers' control. But most of these industries in the post-Fordist era have a chain of upstream and downstream industries. And the main question would workers' control be is that whether the worker control is limited to the production plant itself or should involve the whole chain. Let us take the same Haftapeh agribusiness case. In the upstream are large 100,000 hectares, about 250,000 acres sugarcane plantation. Large number of agricultural workers and peasant workers. And electricity provided by Iranian power grid, and also massive irrigation system controlled by the province. Obviously, the worker control of the sugar and paper production plant cannot include the control of water and power, which are shared by other users. Here I put aside the fact that this ailing and extremely polluting plant needs massive technological renovation and investment. That was one of the reasons that workers of this plant soon demanded that the company becomes state-owned, as you saw also in the video. Instead of advocating for a managerial council for workers' control in this and other large industries, there should be a push to create stakeholders' council, شورای ذی‌نفع‌ها, meaning that each of the units in the upstream and downstream, including the plant itself, will have a participative council, and their representatives would go and form the larger council of the whole chain. And in that case, they can really participate and be part of decision making without having the illusion that they can own and control this. The main issue of workers' control is ownership. It's obvious that under capitalism, you cannot control if you don't own. During crisis, companies can be confiscated, as it was the case in Iran, or in Argentina, in Spain, and Portugal, and many other cases. But when the crisis is over, so far as capitalism continues, then you should either purchase the plant by the workers, like in what happened in Argentina in 2000, or be transferred to workers' cooperatives by the government, like in Venezuela of Chavez. In the case of Iran, the proposal of workers' control should also clarify if socialization includes all categories of industries. And in that case, they should expropriate not only the bourgeoisie, but also the extensive traditional middle class, because all those, the majority of those smaller industries are not necessarily capitalists. There are many of them are pre-capitalist because and they have got a master owner in it, you know. Without the master, they will not be able to run the workshop because they don't have the skill. And with the master, then you cannot have worker control and many other complexities. I'm just jumping over them. There are so many other details that in the short time I cannot discuss. Another issue is the question of managing the managerial councils. If we are going to have managerial councils, then let's see, same data, the latest data, I focus on two aspects, skills and education. In terms of skill levels, even I go to the larger industries, 50 plus, which have got more skilled and better prepared workers, see that 30% are unskilled or semi-skilled, 30% are skilled workers, then you have got technicians, engineers, and then 24% office workers. So you have got, in terms of skill and also in terms of class, while all of them, you know, are selling their labor to capital, and in a sense they can be called labor, but in reality I differentiate between the workers and also the new middle class, the salaried. And this is very significant. In terms of skill, now in terms of education, again going to the larger industry which have got the better educated, we have got a small number illiterate, 26% less than high school diploma, and then you have got 45% high school, diploma, and 11% community college, and 15% BA, BS, and then graduate level. So the details of these show that the main question is that would worker control only is limited to the workers or also includes the new middle classes? If it's only workers, as many people argue during the revolution and also they argue now, workers would not be able to manage factories, without engineers, without technicians, particularly in more modern industries. And if they include those, then it is not worker control, it's worker and employees control. I would like to close by arguing that instead of advocating for managerial councils, which is an organization of the future under socialism, what the Iranian workers living and working under the brutal rule of Islamist authoritarianism need is genuine independent unions. What we need now is political democracy at the national level and industrial democracy in the workplace. Industrial democracy is, of course, a relative concept. And the attainment of its different degrees at different organizational level directly relates to the strength of organizational labor. Here I've shown industrial democracy in this matrix very briefly as you see. The degrees of participation, the lowest level of degree of participation is information sharing. Then at the higher level you have got consultation. Management consults with workers but decides on their own. At the higher level you have got co-determination. Both workers and managers decide together. And at the highest level is self-management. Self-management actually is worker control, which, as I said, is out of question for large industries. Now, and then at organizational level, you've got shop floor, you've got unit, factory, and corporations, and then the higher as we move toward these, you will see that, of course, you have got higher degree of participation, for example, co-determination at the factory level and even at the corporate level. And this depends on the strength of the labor. If labor is not organized, if is not strong, even information will not be shared with them. This is the reality. And if they are strong, then they can push and move toward all of these levels. Needless to say that industrial democracy is dependent on political democracy and guaranteed citizen rights. In a non-democratic society, labor does not have the right to have its own genuine unions, let alone be able to collectively bargain for better conditions or for more participation. A most important lesson of the failed revolution of 1979 is that democracy and political freedoms, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and free press are the most crucial factors for the success of any national movement, including labor movement. A major pillar of democratic system is the existence of a strong trade union movement. How to do this is another subject that I've written about, and I would be glad to discuss it if time allows.
Okay, so this is even better because I don't want you guys to. So I have slightly changed the title of my talk. We'll be talking about sort of social bargaining, the sanction in Iran. I'll be covering sort of the more recent wave of protests and the surge in protests over the past 10 years, especially after 2005, we really see a surge in the number of protests in Iran. And sort of to very quickly summarize two main arguments that I would like to make in this talk. First of all, I would like to argue that really the current protest wave that we're seeing emerged as political opportunities for protests really started rising after the nuclear deal with Iran was signed in 2015. And I want to make that argument because I think, at least in the current political discourse, it's often believed that the reimpositions of sanctions by the US in 2018 and the Trump administration have really contributed to protest, but I would like to reject that argument. And I think that what we're really seeing is a reproduction of the sort of political opportunity structure since around 2015. And so it's not really Trump sanctions that have led to higher levels of protest, but really sort of Obama's deal with Iran. Secondly, I would like to argue that of the protests, most of which are labor protests, as we will see, there are sort of two types of solidarities that I would like to talk about. Local and more national solidarities. The vast majority of which are local solidarities, but sometimes we see some sort of cross-regional solidarities also. And the argument that I would like to make about that is that both of these solidarities are very much tied intrinsically to the country's corporatist union structure. So it's very hard for us to understand labor protests in Iran without reference to corporatist unions as they exist throughout the country. And so this is sort of covering part of my PhD research, which looks at corporatist unionism in Iran. Okay, so let's take a little step back. First of all, I'll pull up this. Oh, I will do this. So I pull up this tweet from Secretary Pompeo, which, from a technical point of view, he produced a very bad graph. It's uncalibrated, for one. Two, it's unsourced. We don't really know where this comes from. It's probably from some political organization in exile, I presume. And so, what Pompeo does in this tweet is really showing sort of increase, I think, in the numbers of protests since 2017 to after 2018. You know, he's sort of showing this upward trend with this sort of revolutionary picture in the background. He asks a very, I would say, sociological question: can this be explained? And so, for me, I always get very annoyed with a lot of consultancies, political analysts that produce protest data as a way to providing sort of quick bits of information about political stability or instability in authoritarian countries. And this happens constantly. I see it on Twitter all the time, but I also see it on, I don't know, BBC Monitoring. A variety of consultancies also do it. Sort of with the underlying assumption that as protests or numbers of protests increase, there is a sort of bottom-up push for democratization, or at least these protests should be seen as sort of providing an indicator of democratization and political instability in those countries. And I think that is inherently a flawed perspective to have on these numbers of protests, especially in the Iranian case. And I mean, this is not at least a novel perspective. This is a point that, you know, political scientists and sociologists think for a very long time. So here I provide some data that I just pulled up from one of these news scraping think tanks. It's called the Armed Conflict Location Event Data Project. They sort of collect from newspapers, automatically scrape newspaper data on protests. And so I created this graph, which I think is a better graph, of the numbers of protests since the protests in the Dema protest of late 2017 or 2018 until August 2019, so a month ago, in weekly bin. So I think this is, from a technical point of view, an improved graph over that of Pompeo. What we see, though, if we break this down by type of group, of group that is protesting, we see that the vast majority of these protests are actually labor protests, or protests by workers. Only really the Dema protests in late 2017 or 2018, as you can see, sort of the blue bin there, sort of really sticking out, Those were the week-long sort of protest that has become known and was widely publicized also in Western media as the Dema protests. But for the rest, what we're seeing is mostly workers' protests, and also some of those workers' protests were actually much higher in frequency than the Dema protests. This is more recently, this huge peak sticking out over 150. It hit almost over 100 cities in Iran, which was a teachers' strike, which is quite notable.
Did you also divide them on which city, which of the protests were cities, big cities, or small cities?
Yeah, this can easily be done from this data. I didn't do it right now, but most of these, so at least the teachers' protests, for instance, most of them are organized per city. So we know if it has over 150 cases in terms of frequency, over 150. My presumption is that it hit at least 100 cities across the country. So it's very, in terms of geographical spread, they're very widespread. Okay, so a couple of questions arise here. So workers, we know that workers are protesting a lot. They've been protesting quite a lot. This seems to be in itself a question. One, because in the Iranian context, protest is sort of contentious. There's a risk of repression for people. Secondly, we have sanctioned context in which it's a very difficult investment climate. There's capital flight since around 2010, and again since 2018 onwards. So we have a lot of we have very high levels of unemployment. Labor is easily substituted. So firing becomes very easy. Making protests even more difficult for a lot of workers because they can be substituted quite easily for someone else. And thirdly, we have very few independent unions, right? We have sort of dominance of state corporatism in the country. So why are workers really protesting in such a hostile context? Becomes a question that's quite pressing. And I think we see also, we can compare Iran to the Chinese case, for instance, where we've also seen a rise in labor protests over the past 10, 15 years. But the Chinese case is fundamentally different in the sense that at least there's a very strong economic growth and underlying economic structure that invites workers, or gives them at least some structural power to protest. Whereas in the Iranian case, because unemployment levels are so high, we really don't see that as much. And in fact, I would say that striking itself is not a tactic that is very often used by workers, because most of the factories that they work in are already on the brink often of bankruptcy. So striking becomes a very inefficient way to attack employers and capital more generally. And so a lot of the protests that we see use different other tactics in order to reach a certain goal. And I also mentioned, so in terms of the independent union and the state corporatism aspect, that also is interesting to mention that this is also not a sort of Polish context of the early 1980s where we really see the strong independent unionism and union tradition arising. So we really see neither in the Iranian case. So I think there are two main solidarities that we really see amongst workers. We see a whole lot of local solidarities, and in my I've been studying a lot of these protests via news reports. I've also talked to a lot of the bureaucrats in the country, as well as leaders of many of these corporatist unions. And so my impression is that the local solidarities that exist really try to target local authorities, local government offices, primarily in order to try to speed up certain legal processes and legal cases that are ongoing, but are only very slowly moving, or trying to implement certain legal court decisions that have not been implemented yet, or that the employer does not follow up on. And so really most factory and company protests follow a sort of local solidarity framework, I would say. They really don't go beyond the enterprise itself. On top of that, there are also national solidarities, but what we see there is that there's very little organization, but heavy cross-regional mobilization in order to bargain directly with the government. And it's here that we see more national level unions really starting to play an important role. So important to emphasize for both solidarities is that there's very few sort of protests that transcends class boundaries. This is something, and this also is not restricted only, I think, to labor. It also counts, I think, for a lot of student protests that have been taking place. So let's talk a little bit about these national solidarities first. The solidarities that really transcend regional lines. There are a variety of cases that we've seen over the past couple of years. Some of these national solidarities arise because there exists some form of national unions. We see that with the teachers of the nurses unions in Iran. Some of these national strikes that have taken place are based on very deep national social integration, such as the truck drivers, who have very weak unions, but because of their frequent contact, because they travel and transport goods around the country, are deeply integrated and are able to strike on a national basis. Finally, we've seen some sort of national solidarities emerging alongside lines of national industries, primarily in telecommunications. The telecommunications industry, which has had, I think specifically the inspectors strike frequently across the country. So in terms of unions, they have very little organization, but they're able to mobilize quickly in response to new political opportunities. And I think this is very key. And we also see this in a lot of other more authoritarian contexts where organization is seen as danger and is often quickly responded to by the government, but mobilization is allowed. So in the Iranian case, I think the teachers' union is pretty much a prime example of this type of union. They have about, for the last board election, they had, I think, about 300 participating members across the country. They're based primarily in Tehran, so very small. They have about, I think they have 12 members sitting on the board. They're almost all in Tehran, and they organize the whole thing. So if this, as you saw with the strike a couple of months ago, across the country, really hitting more than 100 cities in the country, which is really big. This is organized mostly from Tehran, really with a few people just sending out text and sending out short messages on social media. So they've been very effective in doing that.
Sorry, Jonathan, what do you mean by co-opetition exactly?
That's a good question. Well, let me just go into that in 1 second. Sure.
Because it was not clear for me, no?
For sure. So, in terms of the argument I was making, so what we see here, and this is from my own sort of event catalog of protests that I've collected from an earlier period of time until 2018. It's a much richer database, I would say, than many of these automatically scraped databases that exist. What we see here is a moving average of the number of protests since 2013 to 2018 on a bi-monthly basis. And as you can see, the number of protests, these are only labor protests, by the way. So the number of protests in Iran was actually quite low. Until 2015, it was only about 2 a day. And all of a sudden, actually this blue line that I draw is exactly when the nuclear deal was signed. You see the number of protests spiking up rapidly. And this is almost entirely produced, this spike, by first teachers' protests across the country, followed by more local solidarities that are sort of trailing these teachers' protests and see that these new political opportunities have emerged. So kind of the argument that I would like to make is that these teachers pick up very well on changes in the composition of and the power play of national elites. After the nuclear deal was signed, really what the teachers unions realized was that the reformists were empowered and that they were able to protest. And so since then, really what we've seen is that protests have remained quite high since 2015. Okay, to go into local solidarities, finally, also to answer your question, what many of these local solidarities do is they arise mainly because workers need government support in legal cases. So they're very closely tied to the system of labor courts and labor arbitration committees that exist throughout the country. These labor courts are very plenty, there are a lot of them, and the law that they are supposed to implement is actually quite pro-worker. Definitely definitely compared to the United States, but also compared to other Middle Eastern countries, I would say. So, however, the way in which many of these labor courts work is corporatist in the sense that they can sort of consist of tripartite committees of workers, employees, and the government as a third party takes in a sort of central role in decision making in those courts. Moreover, they're tied to these unions, which mostly are enterprise level unions, but they're also monitored by the state. So
these are all government. So I don't know exactly.
Sure.
Because the main feature of all these unions are, according to the labor law, workers can have three types of representation. You know that. And the Shura Islamic Council is purely governmental, and the Anjuman Islami is the fascist, wing. But what ironically, it's interesting that even those sometimes have problem with the government. Even those fake government-owned businesses.
I wouldn't say they're completely fake. I think they still exist, and for that reason, they are interesting and I think they play a very important role in. I think they play a very important role in the way in which these social movements and the contentious politics works. This is sort of one of my main arguments. So what happens is that the government plays a crucial role in the way in which these legal decisions about workers' issues are being made. And so workers often collectively come out to protest in order to either speed up the process or invite government authorities to support them in these court cases. What also often happens is that the employer does not, a certain ruling has been made, the employer doesn't implement the ruling that was made by the labor courts, and then often protests occur in order for the government asking the government to implement the ruling. So this also occurs very often. I think there is an interesting correlation between these local solidarities and unionization. We've seen also, since around 2013, we've seen growth in the number of unions in the country. As was discussed, most of these are enterprise level unions, which have inherent weaknesses. And they've been growing faster also after 2015. So now there are over 10,000 unions in Iran, officially registered now. Obviously at this particular point in the severe economic depression that Iran is in, we don't know how many of these unions are working because they depend on the health of the company, the enterprise. But at least in terms of numbers, this is a very huge number, and I think probably one of the highest number of unions in the Middle East. So I think there is an interesting dynamic that could be teased out further between how unions are formed as sort of expressions of these local solidarities, and how, even despite them being corporatist unions, I think, how they, in turn, can provide bases for collective action. So I kind of wanted to end it here. What really we see after 2015, maybe a development that we see after 2015, is that until 2015, the number of protests and legal cases have actually moved quite in tandem. So you see, you could make this argument about them being very, very much tied just on the sort of descriptive statistics. But after 2015, 2016, and 17, we see that really what's happening, that there's a lot more protests and few sort of stable number of legal complaints. So, for instance, if we show this graph here, where the blue line represents the protests, and the red line presents the number of court cases and court complaints about delayed wages. Already look at the numbers. So, about 100,000 court complaints were made in a single year about delayed wages. And the number of protests about that is about a tenth. No, 100. 100 beside of those. They've been trailing, they've sort of been moving in tandem, but after 2015 what we see is that there's been relatively more protests. So I think, I don't really know, I only have hypotheses for this. One of the reasons which would make sense to me, but we would have to see the more sort of recent data of 2018 and 19. One reason for it could be that because there's been sort of economic growth in 2015 and 2016 and sanctions were removed, there has been an increase in the number of more interest-based protests rather than rights-based protests. Because workers sort of saw their structural power increase because of economic growth. This could be one hypothesis that I have, but I think it's an interesting at least development. So yeah, I just want to conclude there. And if there are any questions or clarifying remarks, then we can talk about that.
Yeah, I think we will take all the talks together and then we'll do it.
For sure.
Thank you.
My friends talked about the labor movement. I'm not talking about the labor movement. I'm away from the labor movement. So it's difficult to talk about it when I'm not there. But I should tell you the story of this presentation. That this topic, it is almost 40 years old. And when you get old, your story, I mean, you become a part of history yourself. So that's how I got into this topic. Farhad and Farhad Nomani and I were the co-authors of this work. Before the Iranian Revolution in 1979, we were professors at Tehran University. And a lot of things were happening around us. And we were confronted with this question very frequently by political activists, workers, students. What is the structure, social structure of Iran? And who are these people who are coming to power? The class structure was their question. They wanted to know this. And Farhad and I worked hard and looked around. We didn't find any studies of the class structure of Iran, nor of the Middle East, and nor of anywhere else. So, by 1982, census of population and housing of Iran came out for 1976. We started working on it. Let's figure out. And it's very interesting. I mean, it was very helpful for us to find that out, that the census of population in Iran and almost everywhere else is essentially based on ILO classifications. And for some strange reasons, ILO's classification when you go to occupational status is essentially Marxist. because the occupational status is based on property ownership. That was pretty good. We thought, well, that's what you want. You started working. Well, you know, remember those years, those days, remembers that, they're together. Well, we had to leave Iran. Farhad was lucky to stay in Paris, and I ended up in Ohio. But I mean, life is a lot of chances. You don't control it. So anyway, for some years, Farhad, not telling the story about telling you my research. For years, Farhad did things about Islamic economics, and I did things about Islamic economic from a secular position. And both of us became aligned to us. And then with the Islamic jurisprudence and all this, what does property mean, what does it mean, and all this. And about restructuring of the Iranian economy. Both of us did separate books. And then we came together after we got stabilized and where we were. We were refugees. We were refugees. We had to stabilize ourselves. We had to establish our academic career and get our tenures and sit there. And then we said, okay, let's work on this. Unfortunately, by then, there was a lot more statistics and there were more work on this issue of empirical study of classes. Basically, only rights work. So we worked and studied it. This is not this. We published a book, 2006, Class and Labor in Iran, did the revolution map. There we looked in how the class structure changed in that period, between revolution, after revolution. And we were very thrilled that Eric Oren Wright wrote the praise for our book and said this is the very unique situation that looks at this reconfiguration of classes. We said, cool, that was good. And we were happy with that book, and it's translated in version also. It took 3 years, 4 years of being there. Censorship things would come up. And so once we did that book, there was this question. These are the social classes. This is the social classes, and this is the class structure of Iran. Compared to what? This is the percentage of proletariat, the workers, this is the bourgeoisie, etc. So compared to what? So compared to what? We started looking around. What are the countries that we can compare it to? So we chose Turkey. And we get to it. So we did that. Now this is, again, a comparative study of class reconfiguration of Iran and Turkey in the past decades. Now, I have a bad habit that I have to stand up there, but then if I stand there, and can I, could I go to the show, slideshow? Do you have one of these? Oh, okay.
But
It doesn't work.
That's a recorder.
No, that's
voice recorder. You have been recording me now.
I can do it.
Oh, that's the.
Yeah.
Okay, well, okay. So this part is just a text. We think of class, the study of class is primary source of class is the primary source of inequality in society, only accentuated by differentiation and discrimination of race, ethnicity, gender, in the specific historical conditions. So that is why we think class is important. We also, here, right, all contemporary social movements challenge the existing social inequalities. regardless of their ideological conditions, deal with the notion of or against the notion of exploitation and logical capitalism, or exploitation logical capitalism. And also here comes to the book way that abstract theories stand or fall by the illumination they lend to empirical material. Now, this is important because Marxists don't like empirical studies. That's not very common. It's not very common. Not very common. Well, anyway, no, they become uneasy, and I tell you what, we get to it. Because there is the issue of concrete versus abstract, and they like to talk in the abstract. But when we get to this empirical work, we have to come to the concrete, and that is very difficult. So, thanks. Why Iran and Turkey? Two non-Arab majority Muslim countries of nearly equal-sized population and economy, with many historical similarities, particularly after 1920s. And here is, that's exactly fine. This is our timeline of historical developments. And before that, I should say one thing. For example, I looked at Egypt. I went to Egypt and I just went to tried to find out what they have in terms of data. No. Turkey, Iran and Turkey, according to my experience, are two of the best countries in the Middle East in terms of data. Iran's data is very good. And I can explain if anybody has objection. I can tell you how it is that within this chaos of the Iran, with all these things, that the data that comes out is pretty good. From a statistical center and central bank. Pretty good. Now, the period we start 1920s, 1926 in Iran, is this Reza Shah's crowning in 1926, and 1923 in Turkey. It's Ataturk. So there we have the Shah, here Ataturk. They're both authoritarian and modernizing and secularizing the society. They both are doing it. It's a very similar pattern. State-guided capitalist development in both countries. Very similar there. 1941 to 1953 for Iran is during the Shah Mossadegh period in Iran, and Menderes and Bayar in Turkey. In Iran, it was, all people know that period was a chaotic period in Iran. The economy was basically free market, a muddled form of it. It's not very clear what it is. There was no. There were a lot of political debates and contestations, and most importantly, the anti-British movement in Iran, nationalization of oil industry, and economic Iranian economy under the oil embargo, and the CIA coup d'etat of 1952. The same period in Turkey was a promotion of the Menderes as a promotion of a free market, all the way for free market, because the planning organization, efforts that they were making, integration. Now, Turkey became integrated very smoothly, nicely, softly, gently, friendly into the West imperialist bloc, part of a Marshall Plan, World Bank gave all the studies of it and told them what to do and how to do it. And of course, they sent the troops for the Korean War, became part of NATO, and of course, there was a military coup in May 27, 1960. And of course, the interesting period is 53 to 78 in Iran, and a similar thing is a situation in 60 to 80 in Turkey. Both were developmental states. Iran was quite authoritarian in that period. In Turkey, was still, well, it was a multi-party system, but it was very unstable. most importantly, there was an import substitution industrialization that both of them became engaged in. And this was, I should point out, this was not something that the Iranians decided that, oh, it wants to do import substitution industrialization, and Turkey does that too. There was something happening in the world that about the internationalization of capital which was taking place at the same time. This is the period the multinational corporations developed, and the theory of multinational corporations is made in 1970s, in early 70s, Stephen Heimer and others, Palwa, they write about the internationalization of capital, and this took place both in Iran and Turkey. Growth of manufacturing, growth of the development of these, Iran National in Iran with making waxel, and a lot of things, refrigerators and all the other things that used to be imported to Iran and Turkey that were produced domestically. There was this happening in Iran. In 1962 we had the White Revolution, and in Turkey in 1971 they had the mandate that was given from, was not a full military intervention, well, it was not a coup, it was just say, order the priests to be careful or else we're going to take care of you. And of course 1980 they just did that, and the coup d'etat in Turkey and the revolution in Iran. That's about exactly similar time. Now after that the two countries go to different paths. In Turkey is export promotion or growth by export, promotion, export-oriented growth, liberalization of the market, very liberalization of the market. Turgut Özal was the chief of it, privatization, and of course economic crisis that they had in 2002. And Iran, we had the revolution, and you all know the story, and I don't need to tell you, and you'll remember that, populist stated the structure of involution. Now this is a term we use in our previous book, and what happens is that actually our theoretical analysis is that in Iran after the revolution what happens is a strange case. It's a crisis, but it's not a regular crisis. Crises that happen, they are usually referred to depressions or recession or high inflation or all this. This is not that. What we have is, or somebody calls it deindustrialization. It was not deindustrialization. It was a goofy thing that happened. We call it involution. Involution is a term that's used in pathology. An organ that has cancer, that goes through involution. It grows, but this growth is not a pattern growth. It's a growth that is destructive. There is no advancement in the existence of that organ. So that is what happened in Iran. We had withdrawal of capital. Capital was scarce. We withdrew. Did not. The owners left. The factories were left out there without an owner. And then what are you going to do then? And everybody and a lot of people were fired from their position. They became. The story was that in Iran they said the Bahals became the government, and the government became the Bahals. You know, because everybody pulled out the garages and started having a shop of some form, and all those type of things that happened in that period. Nationalization, confiscation of property, all sorts of it, war, sanction, decline of per capita national income, national output, all this that happened. And then, of course, Turkey was having its export-oriented growth and its privatization. It got into a financial crisis in 2003. It was a kind of a capitalist type of the crisis, unlike that of Iran. And then in 1989 to present, which starts from Rafsanjani's liberalization policies, etc., realignment of exchange rate and exchange rate policies, etc. So we call that the period of de-involution, that is, well, reform and restructuring and reshaping the social order. The economic order was not clear. Now, one of the interesting issues of this period in Iran is nobody still knows what is the social order, what is the economic order. Finally, somebody says, Ya Imam, please tell us what it is going to be this Islamic economics that you told us. Somebody just stated that. And nobody knows. Well, that Farhad and I both wrote about these things in other places, but not here. And of course, in Turkey, 2003, the present populist new liberal policies of AK party, AKP, and Erdogan, and the period, the Kemalization and privatization and export orientation goes on. And so from this period on, we just go through different ways. So now I'm saying these so that we know the structure of economy and the period that we're going to look and see what effect did it have on capitalist development of the two countries in terms of the social classes involved. Thank you. 5 minutes? Well, so let's go just quickly on these because the main thing is left. This is how similar we are in the two countries in terms of population, in terms of population literacy. We were behind Turkey quite a bit, but we have catch up to some extent. Let's go to the next pages. We're going to flip pages quickly. Rate of growth of Iran is very volatile, it's the blue one, and for Turkey it has been pretty steady going up in rate of economic growth. And of course here we measured the mean rate of growth and volatility. We test that. We can see it very clearly when the measures up here. And here is the total factor productivity, which shows any rate of growth, how much is contributed to increasing capital, labor, or increase of human capital. And then what is rest is given to the environment. The growth is due to the existence of environment. So what you see in Iran in 1976, 66, 76 is very high rate of total factor productivity, and then we have the period of 76 to 86 is negative, 76 to 96 is negative, and for Turkey it has been positive except 91, 97. So let's move on to the class. Okay. Now here we have to do, and this is where the challenge starts. How do you define your classes? Well, we define on the basis of ownership of means of production, appropriation of surplus labor, and class function. Now, I will define what these class functions are. For capitalist class, they have legal ownership, they have appropriation of capital, they have function of capital, and of course don't function as labor. Working class, now probably in the state, that's something I have to explain further, but let me just pass it on and then you ask me and I explain. No ownership of means of production, no appropriation of surplus labor, and no function of the capital, but they function as labor. Middle class, now this is where a lot of Iranians are fighting over what the definition is. That's the way we define it. It's a contradictory location. It is an intermediary relation between the ownership of the means of production and the labor. Essentially the managerial class, the people on that level. And they are not the owners of means of production. They receive wages, salary, and something above that is, we call it royalty rent. And that is like, you know, the foreman and in the field time, the person who went there and made sure that all the serfs were doing what they're supposed to do, if they get something which is acting as the agent of the owner in one way or another. And of course the function of capital to that extent, and they gain function of labor because they're workers themselves, they could get fired. And petty bourgeoisie, these are the people who have the means of production, they don't appropriate surplus, and they don't have the function of capital as the capitalists, and of course, they carry on function of workers because they work themselves. Oh, and there was one, state functionaries. Those are people who work for the state in maintaining a social order and facilitating the relations of production and capitalist relations of production. And they're like a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Minister of this or that, and most importantly, the police and the army and all these other things that they're functioning to protect and facilitate the production process. Now, unpaid family workers, we had unpaid family workers, the petty bourgeoisie, function of capital, social control, and surveillance of production function, a production process. That's their job, control of process. And function of labor is production of use surplus value, and control over technical coordination and production of individual and collective labor. Now, let's go next one. Okay, we expect that in the capitalist growth, we have the rise in the growth of the working class, the decline in the share of the petty bourgeoisie, and the rise of the middle class. Let's go next one. Here, the result. Okay. There are a lot of things here I have not said, and I'm expecting you to ask me. I will be happy to explain. This is from here to here is what we showed in our previous book. That is this bit from 76 to 1996 was our previous book. So this, we added this one. This is the involution that period that we are talking. This is what happens to the working class. Falls, decreases. It is not here is the percentage of the total, but actually what we have is the absolute value, the number of the workers, the working class decreases. And of course during the de-involution, this increases. Of course for the petty bourgeoisie, previously was declining. These are in agriculture, the tenant farmers, and in the cities, and the Bapas and Labanioti and carpenters and plumbers and mechanics and all these shops that you could see all over the place. They were declining, but then they grew substantially at the same time that this fall. But then, during the de-involution, right about here, well, this data is for 1996, so the data for 1996 is post-Rafsanjani period, right? And they lost. And that gave rise to the Ahmadinejad type of the phenomena, because they were happy moving here, and they were unhappy because they were limited. But the growth of capitalism during this period that gave rise to politicization against this depolarization that took place, they were not very happy. So, and of course, the capitalists, the number goes up. That's a not very meaningful number, because what Saeed says, 90% of the enterprises are under 10. So, a lot of those small ones increased. Political functionaries for this period goes up. Let's come down. Now, I still am. I'm in a few minutes because I have to compare it to Turkey.
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Okay, could you just quickly let's go. Okay, let's not talk about any of these. Okay, this is Turkey. Now, Turkey has a problem with the census. Its problem in the census is two ways that it makes a comparison with Iran difficult. These are the problems of empirical work. Turkey does not separate state employees from non-state employees, just wage earners. Iran very nicely separates these. Two, Turkey regards everyone who is adult that is in agricultural sector as worker. Then 40% of the workforce in Turkey is agricultural women workers. Now, unpaid family workers. Unpaid family workers is considered 40%. And for Iran, it's very small number. 5%, 6%, 10%. But 40% is too much. And of course, when you compare participation rate of women in Turkey is a very huge number, and for Iran is about 13, 14. For Turkey is 25, 30. Can't be. It is not. So these percentages are after we took the unpaid family workers out. We could have them, we have the numbers. But then all of these become so much smaller in percentages. So Turkey has the working class goes up and the petty bourgeoisie declines. That's how capitalist development happens. And of course, the middle class grows as, the middle class, the managerial class becomes bigger and bigger because as the structure of the firm becomes more complex, more larger firms come into business, so they need more of those. So that's what we have. Now, let's compare the two against each other. No, that's okay, that's fine. No, let's go with the next one. That's going to be yeah. I adjusted that of Iran for making a comparison that first, here in this statistics, later on we improved for Turkey, we got it. They didn't have functionaries, state functionaries. So we took the state functionaries out of here, and we took the unpaid family workers out of here so that we can compare this. We added all the wage workers as state functionaries or not as either here, working class, or here, based on the classifications that we had. And this is the comparison of Iran and Turkey. This is what happens in Turkey. 50%. Here we have about near 60% working class. For Iran is 40. And we haven't gotten to this rate that we had before. And this is how it works. Now, this relates to, I should say that's one of the questions that everybody asks. And so you only look at these numbers. What do these numbers mean? These numbers mean a lot. It means a lot to the extent the people working in Iran have a working class location. Now, whether they are acting as working class, this is a subjective condition. We are not in that study. That is a study of the workers in themselves, for themselves, in themselves, not for themselves. So that is the comparison that we have now. Many people are not happy that we show a very small part of the working population of this working class, but that's how it is, and we hope that it will increase. And because the main problem is right here. As this declines in Iran, it stays pretty much up there. So I stop here, and I'm sure you will have questions, and I'll be happy. Thank you very much.
Of Mohammad and Maljoo's talk is neoliberalization of Iranian economy and its impact on workers.
Let me start by expressing many thanks to the organizers for making this panel possible, and also saying hello to the audiences and the panel participants. The title of my talk, as the organizers have chosen, is Neoliberalization of the Iranian Economics and its Impacts on the Workers. The question to which I intend to provide an answer is how and in what ways have the Iranian popular classes been harmed by the economic policies since the 1979 revolution. In answering this question, I rely on the capital accumulation chain as my conceptual framework without describing it here in full, considering it as the structural conditions of possibility for accumulating capital in the post-revolutionary Iranian economy. Accordingly, first I shall formulate three sources of direct damages made by three interwoven lines of wild assault to the popular classes in various spheres of their own social life, and then I will try to trace the triple sources of indirect damages to them, which have their origin in their special kind of intra-class power relations within the ruling class. The first line is what I call appropriation by dispossession, which is reminiscent of primitive accumulation, although it is certainly neither primitive nor necessarily accumulation in Iranian geography. Appropriation by dispossession consists of some mechanisms with the help of which the economic resources are massively concentrated in the hands of the minority members of the society, be they be from private, public, or semi-private or semi-public sectors. These mechanisms, at least initially far from being directly involved in value production, have had a variety of redistribution effects from powerless majority to powerful minority members of the society, with the result of unprecedented concentration of economic resources for minority at the expense of wide disposition of majority. No direct being some sort of capitalist production, these mechanisms are such non-exploitive economic oppressions as privatization, dysfunctional liquidity creation patterns in the banking system, as well as non-banking financial institutions and their subsequent inflation, patterns of banking and non-banking loans distribution, economic corruption in technocratic body, commodification of various public social services, inefficient taxation system, public budget distribution pattern, and land grabbing. All these mechanisms have activated some non-exploitive but oppressive-based transfer flows from majority to minority. For example, since 1991, privatizations have had an approximately 2 quadrillion reals distribution effect between the appropriators and the dispossessed. Appropriation by dispossession as a critical line of assault on popular classes have deprived them from their means of production and subsistence and common and collective rights, contributing informations of both capitalist and popular classes since the revolution. Parallel to such double class formations, mostly through appropriation by dispossession in post-revolutionary Iran, there have been some exploitive ways in which the private, public, or semi-public employers make labor forces obedient sufficiently in submitting to the working conditions dictated by the former groups to assure the reserve of cheap and submissive workforce as the main factor of production. It is here that I reach the second line of assault, that is, a higher degree of labor commodification since early 1990s. As a whole, commodification represents a special kind of power relation between two sides of the market exchange. The more something gets commodified, the more class-power relation gets imbalanced. This is the case with labor power as well. Along with the gradual higher degree of labor commodification since early 1990s, the individual and collective bargaining powers of the workers have decreased substantially. The first step in weakening of Iranian workers' bargaining power since early 1990s, both analytically and historically speaking, was to make labor casual. In 1990s, only 6% of the workforce had temporary contracts. Today, more than 93% have temporary contracts, thus depriving them of job security. The second step was the rise of highly organized, well-connected human resources contract firms. They were created in the first half of 1990s and mushroomed during the reform era from 1997 to 2005. Marketing themselves as experts in collective bargaining, they function as mediators between workers and employers, albeit mostly in public sector. There is no official data on the number of human resources contract firms, but they have played a crucial role in weakening of the individual bargaining power of the workers by cutting direct legal relations of employees with their employers. The third step, being implemented since early 1990s, was a sharp decrease in the number of low echelon official state employees, so that the percentage of employed members of urban families working in the public sector declined from 33% in 1992 to 16% in 2006, whereas the percentage of the employed members of urban families working in private sector increased from 25% in 1992 to 42% in 2006. Moreover, the share of gross wages and salaries received from public sector per urban household decreased from 19% in 1992 to 10% in 2014, whereas the share of gross wages and salaries received from private sector per urban household increased from 10% in 1992 to 14% in 2014. Depriving these low echelon employees of the protection of the state's employment umbrella and dispatching them to the free labor market has contributed to the weakening of the individual bargaining power of these formerly public but now private sector employees. The fourth step was related to the exemption of small workshops from the labor code, which had already been officially recognized by the 1990s labor code. The fifth step was related to a set of legal approaches that successfully prevent the formation of independent, organized labor, thereby contributing to diminish the collective bargaining power of workers. According to the labor code, the workers of a unit may have only one of these three cases: an Islamic Labor Council, a guild society, or a workers' representative. The labor code does not officially recognize other possible labor bodies. Nevertheless, legally speaking, all authorized labor organizations suffer from several fundamental deficiencies, which in turn contribute to the unmaking of the collective bargaining power of workers. These deficiencies are as follows: no right of organization for the unemployed, no right of organization for the workers employed in the legal public firms and also in small workshops, dependency on both employers and government. As a result of the second line of assault and their decreasing individual and collective bargaining power in workplace and labor markets, the workforces have experienced devastating working conditions directly and hence deteriorating living conditions indirectly. Parallel to appropriation by disposition, as well as the higher degree of labor commodification, the appropriators and employers have been successful in making available the sufficient cheap stock of various environmental resources as another main factor of production. Here, I reached the turn line of assault on popular classes, that is a higher degree of commodification of environment since 1979 revolution. This can be viewed through the lens of rapid expansion of three special types of juridical ownership of environmental resources, that is the private property rights along with the rapid improvement of technology, state possession rights together with an increasingly weakening environmental movement, and religious endowment rights with a growing, strengthening religious sovereign since the revolution. All these three types of ownerships of environmental resources on the part of private propertiers, state possessors, and religious parastatal foundations have expanded unprecedentedly at the expense of two other types of ownership. That is the communal and cooperative rights and cooperative rights of environmental resources on the part of popular classes. In sum, post-revolutionary Iranian public policy has uninterruptedly acknowledged the need to give upper classes a privileged position by accommodating their needs with the hope that gains will trickle down from upper to lower classes if the former is well enough treated. In doing so, only as far as the power relation between upper and lower classes were concerned, by consolidating such a power relation through the three before-mentioned interwoven lines of assault, the ever-strengthening capitalist class relations in post-revolutionary Iran have directly damaged the popular classes. However, these classes were damaged indirectly too. In order to formulate this indirect source of damage, another kind of power relations would be thought of, that is the intra-class power relations within the upper social classes, which can capture another peculiarity of the Iranian political economy. I mean, the ever-weakening capitalist production. This peculiarity has its roots in three chronic crises of value production in workplaces, value realization in the marketplaces, and capital deaccumulation in the domestic economy. Let me explain these one by one. Firstly, owing to the dominance of unproductive, overproductive economic agents in the private sector, as well as of ideological overproductive agents in the public sector, a disproportionate share of national economic resources have been channelized into a broad spectrum of unproductive activities, such as various speculative endeavors related to private sector or ideological and coercive operations related to public sector. A variety of empirical data displays such a structural imbalance regarding the value production in workplaces. For example, between 2005 and 2012, as symbols of unproductive activities in private and public sectors respectively, the numbers of bank branches and cultural centers established in mosques increased 9% and 216% respectively, whereas the number of manufacturing establishments with 10 or more workers as the symbol of productive economic activities decreased 8% during the same period. Also, while the share of financial intermediation in GDP as a symbol of speculative economic activities increased 173% between 1996 and 2011, the share of capital formation of private sector in GDP as a symbol of productive economic activities decreased 9% in the same period. Finally, the distribution of households employed members in industry and mining decreased 27% between 1992 and 2014, while the percentage of those working in financial, insurance, real estate, judicial, and commercial services increased 167% in the same period. Secondly, due to the dominance of commercial capital owners over domestic producers, the latter lacks a sufficient effective demand for their commodities in the domestic market, which has substantially been conquering by foreign producers with the help of commercial capital as a mediator. This situation is a great obstacle to the realization of domestic value in national marketplaces. This can be seen to a certain extent in the structural chronic gap between the value of imports and that of non-oil exports. Another example is related to the value of finished goods in manufacturing establishments with 10 or more workers, which increased to 27% between 2005 and 2011. 227% between 2005 and 2011. Although part of this increase is rooted in inflation, there is no doubt that it also shows the insufficient effective demand for finished goods produced by manufacturing establishments. That is the problem of realization of value in goods and service market. Thirdly, because of the structural abundance of the de-investment of capital over its reinvestment, the rate of capital accumulation has been too low to make capitalist development functional in post-revolutionary Iran. The main divestment agents have been big capital owners of private sector with their large-scale capital flight in seeking economic stability, middle-class members with their small-scale capital flight in seeking civil and political rights in the process of immigration, technocrat managers with their capital flight in purchasing political security in the face of politically insecure future, and the Islamic Republic establishment with its capital outflows in trying to fulfill its foreign policy goals. Although there is no reliable data on the capital flight in Iran, negative capital account balances in most of the post-revolutionary years is the best indicative of the crisis of capital deaccumulation. Based on such overall analysis, I assume that post-revolutionary Iranian society has experienced two simultaneous contradictory phenomena: the ever-strengthening capitalist class relations accompanied by the ever-weakening capitalist production. Structurally speaking, these twin contradictory tendencies, like the ballads of a pair of open scissors, continually compress the popular classes. What practically in part was curbing such compressing had been the harnessing effect of oil export revenues. However, with the international economic sanctions of the recent years, this harnessing effect has increasingly become ineffective. The coexistence of the ever-strengthening capitalist class relations and the ever-weakening capitalist production in Iranian political economy means that the bourgeois classes are able to exercise a great deal of power over the popular classes, but are unable to take up cudgels against the unproductive factions within their own classes. In other words, although the bourgeois classes have dominance over the popular classes, they have no hegemony within the ruling class. Such situation has its origins in the twofold contradictory sources of Sharia and the dysfunctional pseudo-constitutionalism under the Islamic Republic, which have in turn contributed to the double historical processes of the making of the ruling class and the unmaking of the popular classes in post-revolutionary era. Iranian popular classes suffer, to somehow paraphrase Marx, not only from the development of capitalist class relations, but also from the weakening of capitalist production. In the face of daily manifestations of such structural conditions, the popular classes have always reacted seriously, but most in the form of unsuccessful defensive strategy rather than an offensive one. This has been the case with the mostly unorganized labor activities efforts too. Nevertheless, something new has happened since December 2017 massive protests in different parts of the country. For the first time in the past decades, some segments of popular classes, particularly among the workers and school teachers, have tried to stand on their own feet, mostly without hoping to political factions of the Islamic Republic. Their molecular action is nourishing itself on their daily lived experiences, initiatives, and self-sacrifices. With this new exercise, the popular classes are striving to take the painful process of their own making in contemporary Iranian history one step further. However, such new exercise is being once again seriously threatened by both domestic and foreign forces. Both principalist and reformist factions of the establishment, as well as the foreign imperialist power, have unintentionally entered into a holy alliance to undermine this newly found momentum. Being a part of the problem, the principalists have chosen the social and political repressions as their main strategy to effectively block the formation of bottom-up organizations, far from having any viable solution for the current deep economic crisis of the society. In sharp contrast to their own reformist strategy of mass mobilization in order to use people as bargaining chips vis-a-vis the principalists, the reformists have increasingly tended to refrain from sympathizing with the bottom-up popular initiatives, discursively paving the way for the repressive measures of the principalist faction since December 2017. Much more important, however, is the way in which the Trump administration put too big a dent in the bottom-up inchoate popular class movement. Explicitly or implicitly, the regime change strategy seemingly adopted by Trump administration has weakened the movement in at least three ways. Firstly, it devitalizes the movement by imposing economic sanctions and its subsequent economic hardship, which weakens the social actors' capacity to engage in contentious actions aimed at securing their interests. Secondly, it erodes the movement's potential by substantially raising the political costs of individual and collective actions. And thirdly, it de-energizes the movement's participants by spreading passively among those who reach the conclusion that their fate will be sealed by the top-down imperialistic endeavors rather than their own grassroots efforts. Today is a critical moment when the Iranian unmade popular classes are once again under the strong pressures of the twin contradictory powers of domestic autocratic regime and foreign imperialistic yoke. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, great. So Saira asked me to just make a few quick comments about placing the Iranian case in a global context. And I think what's really interesting is we see from history that despite being very different countries, labor upsurges tend to go in clusters at different times in history. And that's true right now. Recently, in the recent years, we're seeing labor upsurge in very different parts of the world, whether it's the ongoing strike wave in China, the general strikes in Southeast Asia and Europe, even the fast food strikes and teacher strikes here in the United States. These are all very different countries and conditions, and yet we're seeing workers fight back. And I think there are a few similarities in the places despite the differences. And one is that they're all situated in the same global economy, and we're all being pressured under neoliberal reforms, which really have forced this labor flexibility that is squeezing people. And this statistic from Mohammad's paper, the switch from 6% had temporary contracts to 93% had temporary contracts in less than a generation. This kind of statistic is enough to push people into action in many parts of the world. And clearly what's happening is we've had a massive shift of power from workers to employers and investors. This massive inequality has created tremendous insecurity for workers around the globe. I think also the similarity is that this may be the first time in modern history when there is no global, there's no model, there's no economic, political model that we're aspiring to. Even those who have promoted neoliberalism and even capitalism are admitting it's not unsustainable. And I don't know if you all saw the Financial Times yesterday released its remake of its brand to say it's now about how do we re-regulate or reform capitalism. So I think what we see is that these workers' protests are taking many different forms. Some are traditional strikes against employers, some are political strikes, some are not even workers at all, but they are allies, worker allies, protesting in the streets. And so I think this case, the Iranian case, gives us a great example of how we need to rethink what the strike means and what worker protest means. We need a new model for understanding our current moment. So thank you again to all of our speakers, and we're gonna have a question and discussion. Who'd like to start?
Can we ask each other?
Sure. Oh, was there a question? Oh, yes.
Hi, I wanted to ask whether, I've been thinking that the different struggles in the current economy happened in disjoint strata. So for example, the elites fight with elites. And labor, I mean, labor's plight is, I think, is pretty universal. However, laborers in each country have their own, they have an interest in their own economy doing better than another, because then they get trickle down benefits from the elites if their elites win against the other country's elites. So, and the same goes with corporations too. If you try, like for example, to regulate or overtax corporations in one country, what you're going to end up doing is benefiting their competitors from other countries. And what's the incentive in that? So I think, to me, that's a pessimistic assessment for labor, because labor is squeezed between a rock and a hard place and squeezed from both sides. And I'm wondering whether there are, how you can solve that contradiction within a country. What could Iran do not to undermine its own battle on these different levels, corporate or elite or what have you, and empower at the same time each working class? And I think that would be a comment for, I think, internationally, because I think an international connection was made. Thank you.
Are there a couple of questions we could do first and then go to the panel, or are we ready to go back to it? I'll hand it over to whoever wants to take that question. Hopefully that audience works.
I can briefly say that the main problem for labor, you know, we have got lots of these movements and labor activities going on around the world, but as we say, they are segmented and they are delinked, you know. And on the one hand, there is this reality that you mentioned, that of course the focus of the labor is on its own economy, you know, and then in many cases you would see that even, for example, American labor, yeah, they become anti-Mexican labor, you know, because they are losing their jobs and other things, right? This is part of reality. And I think the only way to handle it, again, is organization. We don't have, I mean, labor has become so weak at the national level. And at the international level, almost zero. You know. We have social movements, and many people are excited about social movements. But social movements by themselves, without organization, are like bubbles, and we have seen so many of these cases in the US, in other parts. Labor really, I mean, I don't know how, but the only solution is that as capital has become more organized, in the past, I mean, at the time of Marx, even after that, we never had WTO. We didn't have World Bank. We didn't have IMF. We didn't have all of these huge central banks, your treasury. As capital has become more organized, labor should try also to do this. There should be some links internationally. I don't know how to do it. It's easy to say, but the reason why labor is so weak is because of lack of organization. This is how I understand.
I have something here.
Yeah.
This process is very contradictory in many ways. That is, on the one side, as you said, the American worker is afraid of the immigrants. But on the other side, American workers, at least for the last 10 years, the position of major labor unions in the United States, which used to be very conservative and domestic-oriented, has become more internationalized. That is, the demand for labor standard, which would improve the position of the workers in other places, has been pressed by labor unions of the United States because they know their benefit is in imposing to Chinese government to go by the labor standard. And because if they do, then the position of the workers in China becomes better, and then Apple cannot produce his iPhone there, would be producing it here. So this is going, the same way that capital has become internationalized, and it has protected its privileges through WTO. WTO it does not recognize any country who does not accept the patent laws, the trademark laws, and China has to comply with that. Otherwise, they will be kicked out, or at least if they do it openly and at larger scale. And this whole issue of stealing their technology is part of this whole thing. So on the other side, labor has become internationalized to a smaller extent, of course, but that is the process that will go on. For American workers, it's better to have Bangladesh workers have labor standard. Of course, then the problem becomes, the government of Bangladesh says, if I do this, all these children who are working in the things, and they're providing the means of subsistence for their family, then they cannot work, and we cannot do that. Let us
Think about what would it look like.
Problem of getting old.
You're calling to build industrial unions,
Oh, yes,
and how do you do that? And a participatory arm.
Well, I think what I mean is that councils and unions have historically, from the time that we have had this movement anywhere, going back to Germany, have been separate things, two different things. And combining these two, the idea that happened in Iran, actually the largest political organization, the Fedais, also went for that, and we were responsible for, unfortunately, that mistake. I think it's wrong. We have two different institutions. The unions, of course, when I talk of unions, I'm talking of independent union, independent from the state, and also independent from the parties, political parties, because historically, most of the unions, particularly in social democratic, they were linked to parties, and then ups and downs of parties also imply. So for me, is that the idea is to create independent trade unions, industrial unions, not craft unions, which all we have, because industrial unions can bring a large number of people together. And then these unions, when they want to negotiate with the government, not for their wages, That's the unity. When they are going to sit with management in terms of production and distribution decisions, then they become the participatory arm, not the managerial arm, participatory arm. Because I say that workers as managers is not going to work under capitalism. And also we should not forget that when workers, if workers even become managers, they should act as managers. They should end up firing workers, you know. I mean, you cannot keep on keeping workers, you know. These are the realities of capitalism. I think this is how I understand it. But the more important thing, I think, is what I said, that in terms of Haftape, which also I'm glad that it's also being discussed, you know, by some others, is that when you have to push for creating a stakeholders council. Each unit should have its own union and council. These councils would go to the stakeholder council, and then at that level they can decide together. Because Haftape without water authority cannot do anything. Without electricity, without plantations cannot do anything, and vice versa. I forgot the second question.
Okay.
But I have also questions from the panelists.
I guess so your question to me was about how teachers' unions mobilize, to what extent they have sort of left-wing affiliations. It's interesting from a sort of more structural point of view. Almost all of the teachers in Iran are public teachers, and their wages are almost, it's declining, but still a very large number are. And so most of their wages are determined in sort of budget allocations, yearly budget allocations by the state. So in a way it's similar to the US. And they have a lot of, so the teachers union has existed for quite a long time, and they have, I would say, a lot of experience. They have a sort of older guard of activists that were active in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And they've been to prison a lot. They've been in and out of prison very often. And so that is a smaller faction sort of this union. And a lot of the other ones are, I would say, are younger. And at least the more vocal of these are, and I've had contact with some of them, I would say are very anti-socialist, anti-left-wing. But nonetheless, they strongly believe in organizing for their occupational interests. And so the way in which they do that is through social media has helped them a lot in organizing across provinces. And so they've been really successful since they first started reorganizing in about 2015. And so I would say most of the really nationwide protests that have regularly occurred in Iran are these sort of teachers' strikes. And they've moved from demonstrations and sit-ins to actual strikes, which is also quite significant.
I didn't mean to say anything. What do you call it, disappointing or
pessimistic?
Pessimistic. Well, here are the facts. In 1976, there were 3,649,000 workers, laborers, working class laborers in Iran. That was 41% of the working population. In 1986, 10 years later, with the increase in population, working class population from 8,700,000 to 11 million, the number of workers, working class people, which was 3,600,000, comes to 2,700,000. That is the absolute number of workers, laborers, working class, decreases. Now, from 76 to 2011, whatever number of years that is, that's about 30 some years, I suppose. They said there are three kinds of economists, those who can count and those who can't. So, in 1976, 41% of working population in Iran were working class, according to our calculations. According to our calculation, in 2011, only 31%. That's a decline. Now, in percentage of working class in the population, we can put any positive element into this, but this is what the number is. And now, this is not disappointing for me, this is a fact, this is reality. I'm a social scientist, I have to look at what the reality is. This is disappointing for those people who expect a socialist revolution outside. I mean, with 31% of the working class being this, and then this is only class location. I'm not talking about class positioning. That is a class for itself. I'm not talking about the existence of real labor, independent labor unions who can demand the things that they want. So this is the fact. Now, what happens? Now, on the one other side of it, if you have a continuation of the Shah's condition, we would have had a more continuous capitalist growth. And we would have had more labor, I suppose, that they required it, and they would destroy the petty bourgeoisie the same way that Güzel took care of the petty bourgeoisie in Turkey, and then the working class increased. Now, these are the contradictory historical conditions. I mean, the movement of the change is not a linear one in any way. These sort of thing happens. But these sort of things, in a way, I don't like the way that the Iranian Revolution went, but I'm not unhappy that the revolution took place in Iran. There are a lot of positive things that happens through these social changes. Now, there is something that I want to address, something that you made in your statement, that there's no model. The process of moving from feudal society to a capitalist society didn't have a model. And that was a social revolution, it was a social change. Even Marx is doing that, and the first chapter of the Manifesto says that the greatest revolution that takes happen in history. Now, did the people in the 16th century say, well, we want to have capitalism? They didn't even know what they were doing. They just wanted to have their rights to do the things that they wanted to do. And they fought for it, and it took 400 years. More, whatever. Give or take a century. I think this view is important. The historical context is important. We don't have to have a model. If people are moving toward the things that the underclasses want, this is evolving into new things that may not work. I'm sorry for my friends who think that the transition from capitalism has a particular way that my friend Saeed suggests, or the ones who want to have an immediate socialist revolution. I don't know how the hell that's going to look. And it's going to be nasty for the next maybe 100 years. And you don't sit down and expect that the next generation is going to get to the heaven of some sort. This is a process that takes place, and we have to accept it and say, within the context of this process, what should the underclass do? Now, the underclass of people are some of those Hezbollah too. Not that you want to make an alliance with them, but they are the underclass. They are struggling, but they found their way that way. The salvation is in the other world, or here through beating on the head of the people on the left or labor union. But this is how it goes. We have to be realistic about the situation.
So you say something, you say, sorry, I wasn't clear, because you spoke very fast when you say the transition between capitalism and you say other things, but I didn't get it. You spoke very
I don't know what that other thing is, the same way that the people in the 16th century didn't know that the other thing that they're fighting for is capitalism. I don't know. And if somebody knows, I don't think they're going to be right. History is going to show them. I'm not going to be there to tell them again. They're not going to be there either, because this process is not as It's not a fast process. It's not something that takes place in the century. And I'm saying this in front of a historian who doesn't like to hear that. But this is what happens. Historical process is a slow process. And it doesn't have any particular pattern that we'll go through, as it did not have from feudalism to capitalism.
Saeed wanted to comment, and we may need to wrap up soon. Yeah, let me give you the mic.
I mean, the 2 point, going back to, I mean, your paper is very interesting. I think it's very important that you are recording all this movement. In terms of unions, I think we should be very clear. You refer to some 2,000-something unions in Iran. Actually, we don't have unions. If you, I'm talking about industrial unions. I mean, teachers and others is a different story. If you, I'm sure you have read the قانون اسلامی کار or Islamic work councils. If you look at their function, one of their function is cooperating with management. The second one, cooperating with Islamic associations, to propagate ideas of Islam. So, and then the way they are elected, under the supervision of the Wazarat Kar, Minister of Labor, nobody calls them union. I know that inside Iran, if you say that these are unions, people would really go very upset, The unions that we have in the industries actually are...
I mean, this is not proven. We don't know.
No.
We have no surveys on this. We've not asked workers
No.
about how they feel.
It's not a question of, we know how the industries are run and how people are elected to these bodies, how Khane Kar is elected, how management and government is controlling the elections of this. So this is just a friendly warning, that, I mean, if you would mention that when for Americans you say union, they know what union comes to their mind. But to Iranian workers saying union, which union? The unions that we have in Iran, there are 4 sort of illegal, semi-legal. One, the most significant one was Shirkat Wahid, Autobusrani, the bus drivers union, which their leaders, many of them are in jail, and other things. Then you have got the Haftape, actually. Haftape created this union, and that's why they are being punished so badly by the government. Then you have the Fulad Ahwaz again, and this is it. Even the Qanun, the labor law, the labor for councils says that creation of these in large industries, in oil, in steel, in auto, and the things should be considered later. Even for that, even they didn't bother, to have this. So this is one. On Sohrab's paper, of course, most interesting. Farhad paper. I think you have a problem of definition. You didn't have time to define, exactly what exactly you mean by middle class, what you mean by petty bourgeoisie, and then the delineation between capitalists and the petty bourgeoisie. Where do you draw the line?
The capitalism and the what?
And the petty bourgeoisie. Petty bourgeoisie, small bourgeoisie, the traditional guilds, for example, those who themselves also are in the process of working.
That's exactly the definition.
Yeah. This is that's it. No. I think the delineation between these two. Who becomes capitalist? Because petty capitalists.
Sure, I got the point. Can I answer?
They all. I'm not. I finished. Even even petty bourgeoisie also hires. They hire also, but the amount of surplus value that they extract is not enough that they would not need to work. They have to work also. When we say that, middle class,
state functionaries. The state functionaries, I think,
That's not
middle class. I mean, I know that you have created a set of definitions, but these definitions, I think, it's not clear that what is the difference between an accountant in the government and an accountant in an auto industry? Both of them are. No. So I think definitions should be clarified.
This is exactly the problem of doing empirical work, because so we take this definition. A capitalist is a person that doesn't employ even one person. That is the petty bourgeoisie in a statistical the census that it is there. So if a person employs another person, it's called a capitalist.
No,
now,
true.
You don't like it, that's all right. But we
Marx,
not just explain this. This is the clear definition. Now, you would like to have a person who would employ up to 5 workers, possibly. You say, okay, until 5 workers, I could consider petty bourgeoisie. I said, okay, do it. Go ahead and do it. Count it, and we have another count for up to 5. The statistical data doesn't give me that. But now, what we have said here, we define according to our definition, which is very clear. There is no doubt about it. Anyone who hires someone else, it's an exploitative relationship, and therefore is a capitalist. Now, that is not, you may argue, for on the subjective level as well. You say somebody who employs one worker, he essentially is not really considering himself capitalist. Subjectively, he's not a capitalist. He doesn't act like a capitalist, etc. And I said, you're very correct. Go ahead and count it that way, and I agree with you. I said, this is Saeed's definition of petty bourgeoisie. That is a capitalist up to 6 workers, or 7. I don't know. 8? Well, you'll find a way. Now, here is the point. Here is the point. This is the problem of going from abstract to concrete. Concrete, you cannot do it. I cannot say where your cousin is. Your cousin is probably a doctor who has a nurse. Is he a capitalist? According to this definition, probably will become. Okay? But if he's a doctor who doesn't have a nurse, then probably it's a petit bourgeois. Now, this is very well known. This is well known. This is not, there's nothing funny about that. It is the fact that when you work with this, you know the limits of your analysis. I'll explain what the limits of this analysis is. And for middle class, yes, some people don't like to call petit bourgeoisie, they call the petit bourgeoisie, the modern petit bourgeoisie at the middle class. That is, where was, go ahead and find your petit bourgeoisie according to your definition and then put them on the middle class and then I talk with you. But we define middle class as this person who is at the position that has some control over the labor process. And we do, again, we go according to the statistic there is, and there is no laser line that we draw. It is there. You go and you say you modify this, expand it, in terms of the capitalists. There are various, you say capitalists, 90% of the Iranian capital enterprises have less than 10 workers. Now, in our definition, most of those have become capitalists. In your definition, they may not. You know, you want to take it after 10 workers, as you say. But why 10 workers? Why not 11 workers? Why not 6 workers? How do you want to do that? So clear your definition and come up with it. But we go according to the very clear ideas.
So only one point. In terms of middle class, even you said that you need also to differentiate the layers of middle class, the lower, middle, and upper, because
you can do that too.
No, because the lower one does not have those capabilities that you mentioned.
The lower, then it's not a middle class. Then it's a working class.
Janitor.
No, then this is a working class. If he doesn't have that.
So I think maybe we're at our time here, and should we just wrap up? And thanks so much to our panel, and thanks so much to our organizers, and thank you all for coming.